Government Order of the Day number 2 to 4.
Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Transitional Provisions Amendment Bill, Committee Stage. Environmental Reporting Bill, Committee Stage continued. New Zealand Superannuation and Retirement Income Bill, Committee Stage.
Tell me when to say it. I declare the House in committee for consideration of the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Transitional Provisions Amendment Bill, for further consideration of the Environmental Reporting Bill, and for consideration of the New Zealand Superannuation and Retirement Income Amendment Bill.
Madam Speaker.
Confused as to what happened there, but anyway.
Members, the House is in committee for consideration of the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Transitional Provisions Amendment Bill, for further consideration of the Environmental Reporting Bill, and for consideration of the New Zealand Superannuation and Retirement Income Amendment Bill. Members, we first come to the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Transitional Provisions Amendment Bill, and the question is that Clause 1 stand part. I call Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Chairman, and I'm happy to take a call on this very short piece of legislation that actually only has 4 clauses but does something very important. Before I get underway with my speech, I would like to acknowledge the work that the Select Committee has done on this bill, and I'd like to acknowledge the work of the Chair of that Select Committee, Scott Simpson, on this. Because, Mr Chairman, I think that actually this legislation that we're here debating in the House that Labor does support is actually an example of how a Select Committee can have a very good influence on a legislative on a piece of legislation and can improve legislation that comes before the committee. So, Mr Chairman, although this is a very short piece of legislation, there is one clause of substance, and that being Clause 4, which amends Section 162 of the Exclusive Economic Zone Act. What, in effect, this bill does, Mr Speaker, is allows for the continuation of oil and gas operations, both while they lodge their applications and while there may be appeals against those applications for 4 specific operators who were in existence before the legislation was passed, in terms of the EEZ legislation that was passed in 2013. So, Mr Speaker, what we are here doing is actually paying fix-up again. We are paying fix-up on a piece of legislation that the primary piece of legislation needed to be sent back to Select Committee for a major piece of redrafting. That piece of legislation then came before this House and the previous Parliament with a 14-page SOP from the Minister, because so many changes needed to be made to a very flawed piece of legislation. 1 month after the passage of that legislation, Mr Chairman, there was a 37-page amendment bill in the Marine Legislation Bill.
Clause 1.
Yes, it's
Title.
Clause 1, Mr Speaker, that's right, and that is the title clause, which is around the Exclusive Economic Zone. So it's the Exclusive Economic Zone fix-up bill that we're talking about here, Mr Speaker. The piece of legislation that has had to play fix-up on the legislation, and not for the first time, as I was cataloguing there, Mr Chairman, that we had the 37 pages of amendments to the Marine Legislation Bill brought by the Honourable Jerry Brownlee. But here we are again with the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Transitional Provisions Amendment Bill, or the Exclusive Economic Zone Fix-Up Bill, as I prefer to call it. And here we are yet again. Because, Mr Speaker, if we weren't doing this fix-up bill, what we would be doing is facing the closure of one of our main sources of natural gas at the end of this month. That this legislation is required because this government did not put in place adequate transitional arrangements into the principal legislation to allow 4 existing operators to transition into a regulatory regime. Now, Mr Chairman, it wouldn't exactly be rocket science to think we're putting in place a new regulatory regime, we've got some existing operators, we need to bring them inside the regulatory framework. Instead, Instead, that was just left silent, and there was a big gaping hole which could have led to huge economic cost to the country. We in the Labour Party absolutely believe in the need for a managed transition away from fossil fuels, but simply shutting down a platform with no planning around it because a government has made a mistake in legislation is not the way to do that, Mr Chairman. That this is fix-up legislation, that what we are, and whose bungle are we fixing this time? Because when we came to look at this legislation, this again was poorly drafted legislation. So we are here doing a Nick Smith fix-up here in the House, and the Select Committee. I guess the one thing we can be grateful for is that there were no provisions in the legislation for either power transfer stations or cemeteries to be put on the Maui platform, because that's the kind of bungle that minister can make, Mr Chairman. That we are here because we are working on what the very good work that the committee has done, and the fact that we would have had very open-ended legislation. So, Mr Chairman, talking to clause 1 of this bill, it being the exclusive economic zone fix-up legislation, if it weren't for the work of the committee, that we would have been back here in only a very short period of time, Mr Chairman. Mr Chairman?
Gareth Hughes.
Cut in my prime.